"Stop that voice." The command cracked across the temple like a whip, sharp enough to silence even the echo of breath. Yet the note lingered anyway, soft, trembling, alive. And somewhere beneath the vaulted ceiling of Moonvale Temple, Elena Whitmore froze with her fingers clenched in the folds of her gray choir robe, her heart beating so loudly she was certain it would betray her before her voice ever could. She hadn't meant to be heard, not truly. She had learned long ago how to make herself small, how to dissolve into shadows and harmonies and let others take the light. But tonight the sound had slipped out of her like a secret she could no longer keep, rising past the velvet curtains and polished marble and the hundreds of gathered wolves dressed in silk and power. And for a moment the world had shifted, not visibly, not in any way that could be named, but enough that the air felt different, charged, as if something ancient had turned its attention toward her. Elena swallowed hard, lowering her head as the other voices in the choir faltered around her, some casting nervous glances, others shrinking away as if proximity alone could condemn them, because everyone knew the rule. Omegas did not stand out. They did not draw attention. They certainly did not disrupt a royal choosing ceremony. And especially not her, not the girl marked unstable, the one whispered about in corridors, the one whose voice had once made a young alpha stumble back in confusion he couldn't explain. She pressed her lips together, willing silence, willing invisibility. But the echo of that single note still vibrated in her chest, refusing to die. And across the grand hall, something else stirred. King Lucian Blackthorn had not planned to move. He had entered as he always did, measured, controlled, every step deliberate, every gaze calculated. But now his breath caught in a way that made no sense, his shoulders tightening as though something unseen had brushed against him. And he stood there, tall and immovable, in the center aisle, surrounded by expectant nobles and carefully poised candidates, yet hearing none of it, seeing none of it, because beneath the fading hush, beneath the orchestrated ceremony, there had been a sound that did not belong to the script, a voice that did not ask permission to exist. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, not in anger, not in command, but in recognition he could not explain, and the more he tried to dismiss it, the stronger it pulled, threading through his thoughts like a memory he had never lived. Elena dared not look up, but she felt it, the shift in the room, the subtle change in pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. And when the king took his first step, it wasn't toward the throne or the waiting line of hopefuls. It was toward the shadows behind the choir, toward the place no one ever looked, and for the first time that night, fear and something dangerously close to hope collided in her chest, because whatever had just begun, it was no longer something she could hide from. The sound of his footsteps should have blended into the ceremony, measured and distant like every royal movement before, but tonight each step landed with a weight that pulled the entire hall off balance, and Elena felt it before she dared to understand it. A subtle shift in the air that pressed against her skin and made her breath shallow, as if the space itself was narrowing around her. No one moved to stop him. No one spoke. Because when a king changed direction without warning, it was not questioned, it was endured. And yet confusion rippled quietly through the gathered wolves as Lucian Blackthorn walked past silken gowns and carefully practiced smiles without so much as a glance, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond them, somewhere unseen. Elena kept her head bowed, her pulse racing so fast it blurred into a steady hum in her ears, and she tried to disappear into the line of singers, tried to match their stillness, their silence. But her body betrayed her in the smallest ways, the tightening of her shoulders, the uneven rise of her breath, the faint tremor in her hands hidden beneath fabric that suddenly felt far too thin to shield her. She should not have sung. She knew that now with a clarity that stung, because attention in this place did not bring admiration. It brought scrutiny, and scrutiny had always ended the same way. For someone like her, quietly removed, quietly forgotten, as though she had never stood there at all. The curtain before them stirred slightly as air shifted, and Elena's throat tightened as the distant murmur of the hall faded into something heavier, something waiting. And then the sound came again, not from her this time, but from the echo left behind, a phantom vibration that lingered in the marble and stone, refusing to fade completely. And she felt it resonate through her chest like a second heartbeat she could not silence. Lucian slowed, not because he chose to, but because something in him demanded it, something instinctive and undeniable that pulled tighter with every step closer to the source. And he exhaled slowly, as though steadying himself against a current no one else could feel, his control slipping not in visible ways but in the subtle shift of his focus, the narrowing of his attention until the vast hall no longer existed beyond the thin veil ahead. Behind the curtain, one of the older choir women cast Elena a sharp glance, warning clear in her eyes. But Elena could not respond, could not even lift her head, because something deeper than fear had taken hold, something that whispered that this moment had been waiting long before she ever stepped into this temple. And when the king's shadow reached the edge of the curtain, stretching across the marble floor like a line she could not cross back from, her breath caught completely, suspended between silence and the dangerous pull of a voice she no longer trusted herself to control, and for the first time in her life, hiding felt impossible, as if the very thing she had spent years burying had finally decided to be found. The curtain moved before anyone touched it, just a slight ripple as if the air itself had decided to part, and Elena felt her knees weaken beneath her as the shadow on the marble sharpened into something unmistakable, something real, and she knew without looking that he was there, close enough now that the space between them no longer felt like distance, but like a held breath waiting to break. Every instinct she had built over years screamed at her to stay silent, to shrink, to let the moment pass unnoticed, but the strange, aching pull in her chest refused to obey, rising instead with a quiet insistence that felt older than fear, older than rules, and her fingers tightened against the fabric at her sides as she tried to steady herself. Beyond the curtain, the hall remained unnaturally still, hundreds of eyes fixed on a scene they could not yet see, their whispers swallowed by the tension that stretched thin as glass. And Lucian stood there, unmoving for a single suspended second, as though confirming what he already knew without understanding how. His gaze locked on the faint outline of figures hidden behind the veil, but it was not all of them he felt. It was one, a presence that did not fade into the collective, a sound that lingered even in silence. He lifted his hand, not with the commanding force of a king, but with a deliberate slowness that carried something far more dangerous, something personal. And when his fingers closed around the edge of the curtain, Elena's breath stopped completely, her world narrowing to that single point where concealment ended. The fabric parted just enough to let light spill through, cutting across her vision, and she instinctively lowered her gaze further, unable to meet what waited on the other side, her pulse echoing so loudly it drowned out everything else. Yet beneath it, beneath the fear and the pressure and the overwhelming awareness of being seen, there was something else, something that did not belong to. Panic, a fragile thread of recognition she could not explain. Lucian's eyes found her immediately, not searching, not scanning, but finding, as though there had never been any doubt. And for a moment he did not speak, did not move, because the reality before him did not match the expectation of anything he had been told about this ceremony, about these roles, about what he was meant to choose. And yet none of that seemed to matter, because the connection that had drawn him here did not ask for permission from tradition. Elena felt the weight of his gaze like warmth against her skin, not harsh, not condemning, but steady, unwavering, and it only made her more certain that she had made a mistake, that she had crossed an invisible line she could not return from, and slowly, almost instinctively, she lowered herself to her knees, the motion automatic, ingrained from years of knowing her place, her head bowed in silent acceptance of whatever consequence would follow. The other choir members shifted slightly around her, uncertainty flickering through them, but none dared to speak. None dared to interrupt the fragile stillness that had settled between King and Omega. And when Lucian finally stepped forward, crossing the threshold fully, the distance between them disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but the quiet, undeniable presence of two lives that had just collided in a way neither of them had been prepared to face. Silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, stretched tight between them like something fragile that could break with the smallest sound. And Elena stayed where she was, knees pressed against the cold marble, her head bowed because she did not trust herself to do anything else, not when every instinct told her she had been seen too clearly, too completely. And yet no command came, No dismissal, no sharp word to remind her of her place. Only the quiet presence of the man standing before her, close enough now that she could sense the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing that did not match the tension filling the hall. Lucian studied her in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself, not as a king evaluating a subject, but as something deeper, something instinctive that refused to categorize what he was feeling, because nothing about this moment aligned with logic, not the pull that had drawn him here, not the way her voice still echoed in his mind as though it belonged there, woven into him in a way he could not explain. The others behind her shifted uneasily, the faint rustle of fabric betraying their confusion, their fear, but no one dared interrupt, because the air had changed too much, the balance of the room tilting towards something none of them understood. Elena swallowed, her throat tight, the memory of that single note still lingering like a mistake she could not take back, and she forced her voice to stay silent even as it trembled inside her, because speaking now felt more dangerous than anything she had done before. A long moment passed, measured not in seconds but in heartbeats, and then Lucian exhaled slowly, as though releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the formal edge it carried in the hall, quieter, but somehow more powerful for it. "Look at me," he said, not as an order, but as something closer to a request. And the difference alone was enough to send a ripple through the unseen audience beyond the curtain. Elena hesitated, her fingers tightening against her robe, because no one had ever asked her that before. Not like this, not without expectation or judgment already attached. And for a second, she almost refused, almost chose the safety of staying hidden even now. But something in his tone held her there, steady and unyielding in a way that felt less like pressure and more like certainty. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her head, her gaze rising just enough to meet his, and the moment their eyes connected, the world seemed to narrow again. The distant hall, the watching crowd, the rules and expectations all fading into something distant and irrelevant. Lucian did not look away, did not flinch or shift as others might have, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute, as though confirming what he had felt before he ever saw her. And Elena felt it again, that strange recognition, threading through her chest, not fear, not quite, but something that made her breath catch and her voice stirred dangerously at the edges of her control. Neither of them spoke for another moment, because words suddenly felt insufficient, too small to contain what was happening. And yet it was in that silence that everything changed, because for the first time, Elena realized she was not invisible, not here, not now. And Lucian understood just as clearly that whatever he had been meant to find tonight, it had not been waiting in the light, but hidden in the quiet voice no one else had thought to follow. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough that the silence began to feel like a question waiting for an answer neither of them knew how to give. And Elena felt it building inside her again, that fragile pressure in her chest that had nowhere to go, her voice stirring against her will, as though it recognized something in him that she could not yet name, and she drew in a careful breath, hoping to steady it, to keep it contained. But the air itself felt different now, charged with something that made control harder to hold. Lucian noticed it immediately, not the movement itself, but the shift beneath it, the subtle change in the rhythm of her breathing, the way the space between them seemed to tighten in response. And without thinking, he stepped closer, closing the last remaining distance with a quiet certainty that did not ask permission from logic or protocol. And the faintest flicker of alarm passed through the unseen watchers beyond the curtain, because kings did not move like this, not without purpose, not without distance. And yet here he stood, within arm's reach of someone no one had even considered. Elena's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second as he approached, instinct urging her to retreat, even as something deeper held her in place. And she felt suddenly exposed in a way that had nothing to do with sight, as if he could hear more than her voice, as if he could sense the very thing she had spent her life trying to bury, and it made her chest tighten further, the pressure rising until it trembled at the edge of release. "Do not hide it," Lucian said quietly, his voice steady but softened in a way that carried none of the sharp authority it had held before. And the words startled her more than any command could have, because they were not a warning, not a reprimand, but something closer to understanding, something that suggested he already knew what she was trying to suppress. Elena shook her head almost imperceptibly, fear flickering across her expression as she whispered, "I am not supposed to be heard." The admission, slipping out before she could stop it, her voice barely more than a breath, and yet it lingered in the space between them with the same quiet weight as before, impossible to ignore. Lucian's expression shifted. Slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of the truth behind her words. The way they carried years of silence, of being overlooked, of being told she did not belong in the light that filled the hall beyond. And something in him resisted that immediately, instinctively, not out of defiance, but out of certainty that it was wrong. "And yet I heard you," he replied. The simplicity of the statement grounding the moment in a way nothing else could, and Elena felt the fragile thread inside her pull tighter, the sound she had tried to bury rising again, not forced this time, not accidental, but inevitable. Her lips parted slightly as she struggled against it, her breath unsteady, because she knew what would happen if she let it out again, knew the risk, the consequences, the attention it would draw. But the more she resisted, the stronger it became, as though the voice itself had decided it no longer belonged to silence. Lucian did not step back, did not break the connection, his gaze steady on hers as if waiting, not demanding, but certain that whatever came next mattered. And for a moment the entire world seemed to hold still around them, suspended on the edge of a single choice Elena was no longer sure she could control. It began as a breath she could not hold, a quiet exhale that trembled on the edge of becoming something more, and Elena felt it slip past her control before she could stop it, the sound rising not in defiance but in surrender, soft at first, barely more than a whisper of tone that brushed against the silence like a fragile thread, and yet it did not fade. It grew, unfolding gently into something clear and steady, something that carried emotion without effort, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. The effect was immediate, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable, the air shifting again in that subtle way that made every sense sharpen, and beyond the curtain, the stillness deepened into something almost reverent, as though the hall itself had chosen to listen. Lucian did not move, but something in him responded, a quiet tension easing beneath the surface as the sound reached him. Not through his ears alone, but through something deeper, something instinctive that recognized it as familiar in a way that defied reason. And for the first time since entering the temple, the constant pressure of expectation, of duty, of being watched and measured, seemed to fall away, replaced by a clarity that centered entirely on the voice before him. Elena felt it too, the difference in the space around her, the absence of resistance she had always expected, and it startled her more than rejection ever had, because nothing pushed back, nothing told her to stop, and the notes steadied, gaining strength as it carried forward, each breath shaping it into something more certain, more alive, and with every second that passed, the fear that had bound it began to loosen its hold. The other choir members stood frozen, their earlier unease replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, because what they were witnessing did not follow the rules they had been taught. And no one stepped in to interrupt, no voice rose to silence her. As if the moment had slipped beyond control, Lucian's gaze remained fixed on Elena, unwavering, and though his expression stayed composed, there was a shift in his presence, a subtle softening that spoke of recognition rather than judgment. And when the note finally faded, it did not feel like an end, but like the opening of something neither of them could yet see. He drew in a slow breath, as though grounding himself in the aftermath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that echoed the feeling the song had left behind. "Again," he said, not as a demand, but as a need he did not attempt to hide, and Elena hesitated only for a fraction of a second this time, because the fear was still there, but it no longer stood alone. It was matched now by something else, something stronger, something that made silence feel like the greater risk. Her voice rose once more, clearer now, steadier, no longer trying to disappear, and as it filled the space between them, it carried with it the undeniable sense that whatever had begun could not be undone, not by rules, not by expectation, not even by the weight of the crown that stood listening before her. The second note did not tremble the way the first one had. It rose with a quiet certainty that seemed to anchor itself in the space around them. Fuller now, stronger, carrying a depth that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with truth. And Elena felt it resonate through her chest, as if the sound was no longer something she created, but something she revealed, something that had always been there waiting to be heard. The air responded again, but this time it did not tighten. It opened, subtle and vast, as though the walls of the temple had stepped back to make room for it. And beyond the curtain the gathered wolves shifted, not in discomfort, but in something harder to name, a restless awareness that something had changed in a way none of them had prepared for. Lucian's breath slowed, his focus narrowing completely as the voice reached him again, deeper this time, clearer, and whatever resistance had remained inside him dissolved without struggle, replaced by a steady, undeniable pull that felt less like a reaction and more like recognition, as though he had been listening for this sound long before this night, long before this place. He did not look away, did not break the connection, and the longer she sang, the more certain he became that this was not coincidence, not chance, but something written into the very fabric of who they were, something that had found its moment to surface. Elena felt the shift within herself just as clearly, the fear that had once defined her. Voice no longer holding it back, replaced instead by a fragile confidence that grew with every breath, every note settling more firmly into place. And for the first time, she did not try to make it smaller, did not try to hide within it. She allowed it to exist fully, openly, even as the weight of being seen pressed against her. When the sound finally faded, it left behind a stillness that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but expectant, as though the world itself was waiting for what would come next. And Lucian took a step forward, closing the space that had already ceased to matter, his presence steady, grounded in a way that carried quiet authority without force. He studied her for a moment longer, not searching, but confirming, and when he spoke, his voice held that same calm certainty, shaped now by something deeper than duty. "You were never meant to be hidden," he said, the words simple but carrying a weight that echoed through the silence, reaching beyond the curtain, beyond the unseen audience that held its breath at the sound of them. Elena's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in something closer to disbelief, because no one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her as though she belonged anywhere but the background, and the thought alone made her chest tighten again, her voice stirring softly in response as if it understood before she did. A faint murmur rose from the hall, distant but unmistakable now, the first ripple of reaction breaking through the stillness. But Lucian did not turn, did not acknowledge it, his attention remaining exactly where it had settled, unwavering and absolute. And in that moment, the divide between the world beyond the curtain and the quiet space within it felt thinner than it ever had, as though whatever had begun here was about to be seen by everyone. The murmur beyond the curtain grew, not loud enough to break the moment, but present enough to remind Elena that they were no longer hidden, that whatever had been contained in this quiet space was beginning to spill into the world outside. And her breath caught as awareness rushed back in, sharp and overwhelming, because this was not where she was meant to stand, not under this kind of attention, not in front of him. Her gaze flickered downward again, instinct pulling her back toward the safety of lowering herself, of retreating into the place she had always occupied. But the weight of his words lingered, steady and unyielding, holding her in place even as doubt tried to take hold. Lucian sensed the shift immediately, the hesitation threading through her posture, and he moved without thinking, not in urgency, not in force, but with a quiet intention that drew a clear line between what had been and what was now unfolding. And as he stepped fully into the light, the curtain falling further aside with the motion, the separation between them and the hall disappeared entirely. The reaction was instant, the murmur rising into a collective intake of breath as the gathered wolves finally saw what had been hidden, their eyes landing not on a noble candidate or a figure of expected status, but on an omega in a simple gray robe, still kneeling, still uncertain. And for a heartbeat the entire room seemed to struggle to understand what it was witnessing. Elena felt it all at once, the weight of hundreds of gazes, the shift in energy that came with recognition, and her chest tightened as the instinct to shrink returned stronger than before, because now there was no curtain, no shadow to protect her, and she braced herself for the familiar judgment, the quiet dismissal that would restore order to the scene. But it did not come, because Lucian did not step away, did not return to the center of the hall where he was expected. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, between her and the watching crowd, his presence steady and unmistakable. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the temple with a clarity that cut through every whisper. "Stand," he said, not as a command meant to lower her further, but as an invitation that left no room for refusal. And Elena hesitated, her breath unsteady as she looked up at him, searching for something in his expression that might explain this. Something that would make sense of the way the world had shifted in the span of a few moments. What she found, instead, was certainty, calm and unwavering, and slowly, almost uncertainly, she rose to her feet, the movement feeling unfamiliar, exposed, as if she were stepping into a role she had never been allowed to hold. The hall remained silent, waiting, watching, and Lucian turned then, not away from her, but with her, positioning them side by side as he faced the gathered wolves, his gaze sweeping across them not in challenge, but in quiet declaration. And though he had not yet spoken the words, the shift had already begun, the balance of expectation tilting irreversibly as every eye in the room fixed on the Omega who had stepped out of the shadows and into the light beside their king. No one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because the moment had already decided its own weight, and every instinct in the room seemed to recognize that interrupting it would break something that could not be restored. Elena stood beside him, her posture still uncertain, her breath uneven as the reality of where she was settled fully into her awareness, the vastness of the temple, the presence of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom, and herself, an Omega who had spent her life avoiding attention, now standing in the center of it without any shield left to hide behind. And yet the expected collapse of that pressure did not come, because Lucian remained where he was, steady and unmoved, a quiet barrier between her and the judgment she had always known. He let the silence stretch just long enough for every eye to settle, for every doubt to surface, and then he spoke, his voice carrying across the marble hall with a calm authority that did not need to rise to be heard. "You came here expecting a choice," he said, his gaze moving across the gathered nobles and candidates, not harsh, not dismissive, but certain, a display, a decision shaped by status, by expectation, by what has always been done. And a subtle shift passed through the crowd, the truth of his words settling in ways they could not ignore. Elena felt her chest tighten at his side, not from fear this time, but from the growing awareness that something irreversible was unfolding, something that included her, whether she understood it or not. And she kept her eyes forward, her voice silent now, but alive beneath the surface in a way it had never been before. Lucian's gaze returned to her briefly, not questioning, not asking, but confirming once more what he had already accepted. And when he faced the hall again, there was no hesitation left in him, no trace of the expectation that had defined the ceremony when he had first entered. "What I found," he continued, "was not in the light you prepared, but in the voice you chose to ignore." And this time the reaction was undeniable, a ripple moving through the room as understanding began to form, incomplete but unavoidable. Elena felt it, the shift in perception, the weight of being seen not as a shadow, but as something that had changed the course of the night. And it was almost too much to hold, her instincts still pulling her toward retreat even as something stronger held her in place. Lucian took a final step forward, not away from her but with her, his presence aligning with hers in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet finality of a decision already made. "From this moment forward," he said, each word measured, deliberate, "no voice in this kingdom will be silenced for being unseen." And though he did not raise his hand, did not make a grand gesture, the meaning settled clearly, firmly, reaching every corner of the hall. Elena's breath caught softly, the words echoing through her in a way that felt both overwhelming and grounding at once. Because for the first time, the thing she had been told to hide was not being taken from her, it was being given a place. And as the silence that followed deepened into something new, something steady and lasting, the light from the high windows of the temple shifted slightly, catching along the marble and the gathered figures,